Welcome back to another episode of the Hustle Hangover. It has been a little bit since I recorded, but getting back into the swing of things. If you have not seen, I've got a couple other non podcast videos that have gone up, just kind of having some fun and mixing up the content a bit. But on this episode, we are going to kind of pick up where we left off. We had gone over my experience in clinical research, what that looked like, how it kind of prepped me for the next step, which was ultimately going into a med tech, med software startup. We're going to go over some basics around what is a startup? What does that mean? Would I potentially be interested in joining one or even starting one? And then kind of transition into, in general, what has my experience been? What were things that I have loved about it? What are some of the things that that have been a bit of a learning curve, which I guess ultimately is a good thing? And then in the next couple episodes, we'll dive into more of the specifics around what does it mean to be in a product role in the space that I operate in, and then, kind of how I've transitioned from product into more of a partnership alliance strategy role, and how partners play a significant role in helping evolve a startup's trajectory. But kind of zooming out, right? What is a startup? They're not just like small companies. You can have companies that run at a headcount of 10, but they are in an established space. They have a specific group that they work with, and they're mature in terms of their organization, vision, strategy, footprint. Startups are really super early stage companies that are really aimed at either disrupting an existing market or kind of taking advantage of new emerging markets that are materializing. Typically, when you think of a startup, it's someone in their garage with their friend trying to come up with something. And when you are operating, super early days, it is very high risk, but with the chance for a very high reward. About 90% of startups fail. And there's two main reasons for that. One is you built something that you thought the market wanted, or even that the market was ready for, but they weren't. Or you run out of cash, right? Only so many people have the fortune of being able to tinker and try things and not have, revenue coming in from a full-time job to support your lifestyle. But when it does work, particularly in the med space where I currently operate, that can mean a company ultimately being acquired for hundreds of millions of dollars, or the company going public, which is synonymous with an IPO. That is, I think, less likely nowadays with the giants that exist in the space. A perfect example of that is, let's say you're with a medical device company and you make pacemakers for your heart, and they make fake heart valve. Essentially, their product offering is traditionally just multiple startups that were demonstrating clear success in the clinic that they wanted to bring in as part of their portfolio. So at that point, the med device company would approach said startup and, make an offer to acquire them and merge them inside their broader umbrella of products. The alternative, let's say, for example, that pacemaker company could have chosen would be to say, no, thanks, we're good. We think that there's enough here that we could build this out, build out enough revenue, build out enough market share that we can be self-sufficient. So we don't need additional funding sources coming in. Our sales are outperforming our costs, and that there is a broader vision for what they think the technology can do outside of maybe one particular device, which would be the route that you would take to try and inch towards an IPO. But when well-known companies who have giant market share look at you and say, hey, we'll give you this large amount of money, particularly if you have gotten in early, you have a lot of equity or stock in the company. And so not only do you get paid out traditionally, but you also have the opportunity to make a lot of money on that equity component. Speaking of funding, you traditionally have kind of progressive rounds of capital influx. Early on, it's pre-seed or seed investments from people you know, family members, friends. Maybe you've got a close relationship with an angel investor, which are kind of those that give you the first couple bucks to start to bring your product to life. Once you have some traction with those early angel investments or seed investments, you can start looking to venture capital groups to bring in larger amounts of money that you need in kind of progressive rounds, which is all really aimed at scaling the product that you've come up with and ensuring that it continues to evolve to fit the market that you're going after. Let's say, for example, I'm trying to build out a stethoscope that can detect an irregular heartbeat and notify or amplify that sound for the physician while they're doing a physical exam. I'm taking my prototype, which is a stethoscope that I put a chip in and, might be attached to another device that you're wearing on your hip. That's the actual brains behind the operation. You're going to take that and say, well, obviously this prototype would never go into clinical practice. So I need to invest in some research and development about how to actually create the device that is streamlined and it's not uncomfortable for the physician to wear and it's not overly heavy, that sort of stuff. That all takes money and time to bring an initial idea to something that would actually go to the market. And then once it's in the market, you have to test it in the market. I love my fellow MD colleagues. We are one of the hardest consumers to impress. If the user experience of whatever you are developing is not improving their life and or exceeding their expectations for the existing products that they use, it's not going to get adopted. So that, series A, B, and C varies depending on the product that you have and what you're ultimately trying to do with it. But those come in sequence and help you kind of evolve it to the next level. But by series C, the product should really kind of be at a state of maturity that you could go more broadly on the commercial side in the sales enablement and actually bring it to market in a meaningful way. Later stage rounds of investments, which would be like D round, E round, and beyond, those are traditionally investments that are made in a very strategic sense. So let's say that there's a large, cardiac or heart AI group that has had a ton of success with bringing models to the market, but they don't yet have a device arm. They may see a company like a stethoscope company with similar technology as not quite ready to be acquired, but something that they're going to place a bet that this may be something that works and open up more strategic, almost partnership type discussions with them of, hey, how can we put our AI on your stethoscope? Or there's additional funding that comes in to help that company move into a new vertical or a new space. With the example of stethoscope, heart rhythm, that was their focus. Let's say they've gotten some good traction, but they're also hearing from the physicians they work with that if they could also include, let's say, breath sounds or lung sound AI, that would be really beneficial to have as one combined package. So I could go and ask the board to raise another X amount of dollars for us to invest in subject matter expertise on the lung side of the house to help us do that and help us figure out the market in that space as well. Another way to think about it is there's kind of early stage startups, and then there's a phase in which you transition from a startup to what we call a scale up. A startup is more of you're still in the experimentation phase. You're trying to make sure there's that right market fit. You're more deep in the R&D Where a scale up is, okay, we found it. Now we just have to ramp up the teams to increase development, increase sales, increase marketing, all of the things that begin to mature the company. This is usually at the point where you're making about 10 million in repeatable revenue every year. Another interesting part of startup life and then eventually going into scale up life is that startups, they are often strapped for cash. So you're going to come in, you're going to get, unless you're the initial founder or co-founder, you're probably going to get a paycheck. It's going to be less than the market median would be for that role. If you're, let's say, a software engineer, if the market pay is 80K, they'll be like, hey, we can pay you 50, but we'll give you what would be worth 30K in stock options or equity in the company. By the point you've gone through these different rounds of funding, the equity is kind of all tied up in those investors. And so you'll see companies focusing on switching to a very heavily paycheck centric model. Part of the drive for a lot of people to go to a startup instead of a large corporation is that you feel like you actually have influence in certain ways. And it's often driven by a highly focused mission that matters or resonates to you. You really care about helping people, let's say, with strokes because a family member or a friend had suffered a stroke. You may join a startup that's going to pay you less than the market median because you actually care about what you're doing. You really love the mission. You feel like you are contributing positively to society in a meaningful way where you have a greater say in what that is. And I know that the company I joined, that was definitely the case. So that's kind of a quick overview of startups. It's definitely through the lens of medical tech, because that's, again, the world I have lived in. But I want to now transition to kind of my experience of making that transition. So as I mentioned in the last episode, I was doing clinical research. A postdoc who had worked with me had actually come to the company and said, hey, the grass is greener over here. You got to come at least talk to the CEO. And at that point, the company was like somewhere between 20 and 30 people. We had just gotten like an actual office that wasn't, a borrowed table in a basement of a friendly company's office building. And they were looking for a product owner, which at that point in time, I had no idea what that meant. I Googled it, of course. I submitted my application. I heard back. I got to do an interview. When a company is that small, you don't have these like giant panels of people to talk to or multiple rounds. So I ended up talking with the CEO, our president, and maybe our lead engineer, and I think our head of HR at that point in time. And our CEO asked me, you clearly don't have product experience. Do you think that is going to be a problem for you to take on this role? And I guess looking back, it was a little bit of a bold answer that I gave him, but I said, I didn't know anything about chemistry and entrepreneurship. I now have degrees in those. I didn't know medicine. I now have an MD. I didn't know research. And I got to a point where I was running this giant lab. From what I can see and what I've been able to read up on and learn, I don't see why product would be something I couldn't pick up fairly quickly. And he smiled and laughed, and he was like, yep, that's what I was thinking, but just wanted to make sure you were up for the challenge. And I said, yep, totally. And I remember as I was leaving research, one of the reasons why I kind of knew it was time to say goodbye to the research lab I was in, was I was kind of capped out in terms of salary. And I had pushed and pushed and pushed. But when you're grant funded, there's only so much that would actually get approved in grant funding for certain people and their pay. I remember I felt so bold throwing out a number. I'm like, this is what I want to get paid. And in hindsight, I probably should have asked for more because it was an immediate, yes, perfect, great, sign on the dotted line and go. And at that point, I did get a number of stock options that we call them, they're vested over time. So I think my vesting period was 4 years. So I got chunks of those stocks over a period of 4 years, where if I had left, let's say at like year 2, I wouldn't have gotten the rest of them. And so I actually joined in peak COVID. And at that point, my husband and I had a 1-bedroom apartment and he was working from home. And there was no way that we were going to survive, both of us working from home. And so I asked, hey, is there any way I could come into the office? No one else is in. And so I got the special golden badge to be able to go in every day. And I had this giant warehouse. It's a converted warehouse loft. I had the whole floor to myself. It was hilarious. But then I just kind of had to jump in with both feet and start figuring out, what does it mean to be a product owner? What are the team dynamics that I need to be a part of? I was the only real product person. There was a UX designer there at the time as well. And, trying to figure out what the heck a requirements document is and X, Y, and Z. But fairly quickly, I started applying, obviously, all of the things that I know from my background to the initiatives that we had going on, and even started proposing new ones because I knew they would be valuable based on my research experience. And it was definitely a learning curve, not as bad as obviously the one in med school that we talked about. But what I really loved about it once I started getting my footing was that I realized there were no true boundaries around what I could or could not contribute to. I am not someone who stays in their lane well. Actually, right around that time, I had gotten an interview with a very large medical device company, and it was, I think, for a research, like a clinical research spot in-house. And I remember leaving that interview and saying to myself, that is going to be such a restrictive role. You're not going to like it. You'll take it if it's the only thing that you have, but you're not going to like it. In hindsight, I can very much say I would not have enjoyed my time there. But it was really nice, as somewhat of a subject matter expert in-house. We didn't have anyone else who had done a ton of research at that point in time or with an MD. It was a lot of engineers who were doing their best, obviously, to meet the requirements of our customers, but they had never heard the word queries or understood what a reader study was, or understood, how you have to merge electronic medical record data with lab data, with vitals data, with imaging data, with video data. And all of that was super inherent to me. So I kind of rapidly expanded my footprint from, I have this little box of responsibilities, to, helping write user documentation, helping to put together marketing content. Like, how, if I was selling this to a researcher, how would I talk about it? I also started doing some of my own UX design because I'm hands-on, I'm more creative than not, and I'm also visual. And so I really kind of got to touch every part of what we were doing other than coding. I learned how to write JSON docs because that was how we were driving some of our product. But I open GitLab and my eyes go crossed. I have no idea what's going on there, and I actually don't want to know what's going on in there. That's where I draw the line. I will never, well, hopefully we'll never have the need to learn code. So that was really exciting. I felt like my creativity meter had been turned up a ton, which is how you keep me engaged, which is how you get the most out of me. And fairly quickly, that turned into the beginnings of what we talked about in the first episode, which is I started getting a high from feeling like I'm contributing so significantly to a company at a phase of growth that really needed that to happen. And, going in on weekends and playing music, but I'm whiteboarding and, just trying to think through the next thing and what can I be ahead of? What is something that could evolve, what we're working on today, of course, but, to the next phase, because you're trying to grow the company, grow the platform. The other thing that was another massively positive signal for me was our head of HR, who is one of the most incredible people. Every 6 months, I would message her and say, hey, what is the next thing for me here? How can I evolve my role here more significantly? Because I came in, as a product owner, but I really was doing so many other things. As best they could, they always matched my enthusiasm with giving me the next carrot and the next carrot and the next carrot and the next carrot, to the point that I, in a period of maybe 2 years, had, doubled my salary and moved through multiple iterations of roles. And so I always knew that I wasn't stuck in a track. I was able to move around, which is another awesome thing about startups. And one of the things that I now see happen is that a lot of people end up getting into managerial roles, not because they are ready to do so, interested in doing so, want to do so, but because that appears to be the next step in the ladder. So I'm an individual contributor. I'm working on things. I want to evolve. I'm, entry level, senior, principal. Okay, so then my next thing would be director, associate director, manager of. And you go from your hands-on keyboard work, how you demonstrate success, to how does your team's work demonstrate your success. And I did manage teams for a majority of the time, but I am not a good manager. I don't want to manage. And I purposely hired people who were more experienced than me because I needed deeper expertise on my teams. And so at a certain point, we were at this crossroads and I pinged the head of HR and we had the conversation. Do you want to be a manager? Because you're saying you want this next role. Do you want to be a manager or do you want to be an individual contributor? And I felt like if I gave up my managerial responsibilities, I lost some sort of power to influence the org in a broader sense. If I'm pumping information to my team and they're doing things with my direction, I have a shot of getting this initiative off the ground or this thing done. But when I sat and actually thought about what do I want to do and what am I good at, it's all individual contributor work. It's all I see. And then we turned the focus on who's the right person to fill that role that I was in or that I was looking to be in. And couldn't be more happy ever that we made that decision. And the person who we put in that role is now my work bestie, my real life friend. And we tag team a bunch of stuff, which is awesome. But that is that is something that when you go to a startup, you have that flexibility to kind of bop around. I know we've got folks that one of the people that was on my team originally was an engineer, was in compliance, was in finance, I think, at some point, and then came to product. And the thing is, as the company's evolving, you can play different roles. The level of deep compliance expertise that someone needs at a Series A company that's not in a regulated market is not the highest, right? But if you're now a Series D company that is going into regulated markets where validation of your product is critical for adoption in new markets, then yeah, you need someone with the expertise to kind of bring the company along that journey in a more meaningful way. There's a ton of things you can do, especially if you find a place that you really like, you like the mission, you like the overall culture. You are incredibly valuable in-house because you have a ton of historic knowledge and expertise behind why did we make that decision 4 years ago? If you were in the room, you can easily solve that problem for people live and help unblock them. And speaking of culture, that is another thing that is very, to me, was a bit of a shift when I first came and joined the company. The CEO at the time was giving, all hands presentations with a level of transparency that was amazing. I felt like I actually knew what was happening at multiple levels of the company, and especially those that were well above me at that point in time. We were always harping on work-life balance, work-life balance, work-life balance. Don't kill yourself for this job. We know you all work hard. We know you all love the mission. If you need to take a day off, take a day off. It's not that big of a deal. You need a mental health day. Our company mission had things in it like give a shit. Not something that you would print on a slide at a company, like Google or something like that. It was lax in a good way. It was almost boundaryless. You knew almost everything, and you're really kind of deeply involved in the evolution. As we began transitioning from a true, like, scrappy startup to a scale up, you begin to mature. It's more critical that certain things are run certain ways. You've got, larger company goals and objectives that have to go to the board and all of these other things. So some of that begins to slip away. But overall, it really has been a super positive experience, especially for me, because I was breaking into an entirely new career path. And I was able to say, I like this part of that, but I want to do this, but I like to do that more. Oh, I see myself actually now doing this because I had that experience. And I've been able to kind of play the maze game with some flexibility to help me get to kind of the point where I'm at now, where I do have a clearer vision for my career. And that may ultimately guide me into a larger organization so that I can mature that skill set specifically in that area. But I do think that for the rest of my life, I will crave, if not go back to startup world, because I don't like red tape. I don't like super restrictive top-down hierarchy, and I don't like moving slow. I like to make a decision, put it into action, go, succeed and or fail fast. And that's exactly how a startup is designed to operate. You have 6 months to figure this out or you're out of cash. that's a great motivator to move fast and try things. An interesting parallel that I hadn't recognized until I had moved over to this side of the fence, because the hospital I was at was more of a county hospital. It wasn't kind of an academic center. But if you are a researcher and you are looking to make a cleaner kind of one-to-one step from clinical research to a startup, if you look at large innovation centers like Stanford, like Mayo, like MIT, they actually have demonstrated success of kind of launching very early stage startups, putting them in touch with angel investors, and having them actually grow into real companies and products. And I'm sure there are many other universities and systems that have something similar, but I would start poking around at those, hear about kind of the incubation stage ideas and startups that people are working on, see if you can get in with them, talk to them about what they're trying to do, even if you're, volunteering a little bit of your time to help them with some statistical analysis. That could position you for actually joining them in a more material capacity once, the first investment fund comes through. And you would have been there from the very beginning, which could be very profitable. Another avenue that I had not quite explored, but my college, which is local here, they have an MBA program, business school. They also spin out startups that need help with different things. It's not necessarily just med or tech focused, but joining their alumni groups, or if they're hosting an event, going and talking to folks there, that's another great way to have an easier in with a startup than you maybe would if you're just applying through LinkedIn or another kind of job posting center. And to the MDs that are not practicing medicine anymore or never did, there are a ton of startups out there that desperately need your expertise. You will have to take, especially with earlier stage startups, not be making practicing physician money, but it's a really great place with flexibility for you to hone other skills. And, I can tell you there are so many rooms that I've gone into with my MD in a business capacity where it has opened up conversations in a way that would not have been possible had I not had the degree and the inherent kind of community with the people that I'm talking to that really has greatly benefited the company and my success inside the company. But yeah, that was a high level overview of my experience inside a startup. If any of you have questions or are considering going to a startup, feel free to drop them in the comment section. I will reply as best I can. And thanks for coming along and listening. This has actually been a really fun process doing this podcast so far. And I hope you guys are enjoying it too. I will see you next time.